Hello landlords, this is Ernie Garcia, your landlord attorney. We are talking all about your TAA residential apartment lease. We're on pages 3 and 4. Let's get started. So far we've covered sections 1 through 14. Today we'll cover sections 15 through 25. Section 15 of your TAA lease talks about acceleration if your first month's rent isn't paid. Acceleration is the right of the landlord to call the entire amount of the lease due based on the very first default. This right exists for any time that the lease is automatically terminated due to a default. So be aware that if you fail to pay your first month's lease on time, you may be charged an accelerated amount for the entire value of the lease. Section 16 talks about the fact that your lease amounts are actually locked in. Your lease rate cannot be increased during the initial term of your lease. There are ways to increase the rent with written notice after your original lease term has ended though. Now, section 17 of your TAA lease has to do with the delay in occupancy. If the delay in occupancy is the landlord's fault due to, for example, in 17.1, the unit not being ready on the basis of some kind of construction issue, you will have the right, number one, to abate any amount of rent due, but also to terminate the lease if you do it in writing. If in fact you do terminate your written lease in writing, you are entitled to a refund of your deposit, but read section 17 with regard to the parameters of when notice is due. Make sure that you supply notice in writing at the time and place that is required in accordance with this lease. Section 18 of the TAA lease has to do with the disclosure of your own personal information. Your information can be disclosed in accordance with this lease, particularly to a government body, in particular where there is a criminal investigation. So be aware that your information can be shared. You're giving permission in accordance with section 18. Section 19 of your TAA lease has everything to do with the requirements that you're held to under this lease, including the cleanliness of your apartment unit, the kinds of activities you can engage in common areas, even a restriction on prohibited business activity while you are on the TAA lease. Section 19 also extends to your guests. And there are restrictions in section 19 that have to do with your disclosure of certain convictions of crimes that are explained in this section of the lease. Make sure you have read it and you understand it. Along with section 19, which has to do with certain rules, there is specific conduct that is prohibited in section 20 of your lease. That conduct includes the following: criminal behavior, holding hazardous materials in your apartment unit, even annoying or obnoxious behavior is prohibited and may be the basis for a notice of default and ultimately a notice to vacate. Make sure you understand which conduct is absolutely prohibited under this lease. 21 has all to do with parking and the restrictions on parking which the landlord can enforce. There are multiple things that you have to abide by if you're going to park any kind of vehicle on property owned by the landlord. Make sure that you have your vehicle properly registered. Make sure that it's parked in the properly designated area. Those rules should be clearly pointed out in your lease. Section 22 has to do with early termination in very specific situations. In the event of family violence or in the event of death, a lease can be terminated without any additional obligation, but certain notice requirements are needed to be complied with by the tenant or the tenant's next of kin. For a member of the active duty military or National Guard, section 23 of the TAA lease allows for termination of the lease as well. However, again, like with other provisions, you're required to submit certain information in writing to the landlord. One additional benefit extends to the spouse of a person who is on active duty military service. However, it does not extend to everyone. If you are a roommate and not a spouse of someone who is on active duty in the military, those same benefits do not extend to you, and you would be unable to terminate your lease or your obligation to the landlord, even if your roommate is deployed. So be conscious of that, landlords, where tenants are subject to additional and continuing obligations under the lease if they are not a spouse or they themselves are not active duty military. Section 24 of the TAA lease is a long section that has to do with certain safety equipment or safety measures that are taken by the landlord. It's important for the tenant to understand that this section of the lease disclaims any kind of warranty for safety. It is not the duty of the landlord, in accordance with this lease, to keep any party safe from crime. Unfortunately, the landlord is unable to protect everyone from the criminal acts of third parties. Additionally, although a landlord may engage and take some steps to offer certain protection as required under the law, for example with smoke alarms, it is impossible for the landlord to completely keep everyone safe from all possible harm that could come to them. Make sure you read and understand section 24 and what it says about what measures are employed by the landlord and where limits on liability extend. Section 25 of the TAA lease has everything to do with the present condition of the unit in question. There is, at the beginning of this section, an as-is provision, which essentially says you agree that you have reviewed the unit and you accept it in the condition that you find it. Additionally, it requires that you do your best to diligently maintain the property in the same condition that you did find it. And finally, it discusses the fact that under fair housing requirements, that the landlord is obligated to take reasonable steps, but only those steps which are reasonable in order to accommodate for the special needs of certain individuals. Well, I hope you have enjoyed today's video, and I hope you've learned a little bit about the provisions in today's video having to do with sections 15 through 25, or pages 3 and 4 of the TAA apartment lease. If you have additional questions, don't hesitate to add those in the comments below. If you have enjoyed this video, please give us a like. If you have not yet subscribed, there's a picture of me here as well. You can click on the video link that is provided here with additional content for you. And until next time, happy leasing.